I think that was our bell. Oh, welcome to the class again. This is our third topic, fourth lesson. And this week's topic is Why Not God? It Makes Sense. And that the subtitle for this lesson is DNA Points to a Young Earth. And this was kind of a tough one for me, and the reason being is because I'm not a scientist, and but I've heard about DNA, and I know all of us have it. You've heard people say, "Well, that's not in your DNA," which they kind of mean is you shouldn't be doing that because you don't have the right genes to do that kind of stuff. So it's DNA is a subject that is very prevalent in the news today. And the reason being is because, the vaccine that they just gave us is mRNA. And it's not a vaccine in the sense of what we grew up with. It's actually something, the mRNA goes in and tells your cell to make something and it affects your DNA. So it's a lot different than what we're used to or have heard about in the past when we were growing up. So DNA is something that I want to show you that is something that God gave us and God designed from the very beginning, and it points to a young earth, and I'll show you why. Now, if you notice down here at the bottom, it says Creation Ministries International on YouTube and FOCL Online on YouTube. Why is that important? It's because, again, I didn't do research. I'm simply a presenter. And what I'm letting you know is this material that I'm presenting today is just material I got off of going to YouTube channels. Okay? I love going to YouTube podcasts and learning from YouTube. I watch a lot of different people, and every once in a while stuff gets into my feed. And when it gets in my feed, I take a look and see if it's something of interest. And if it is, I'll take a listen. And I guess a few months ago, a creation article got into my feed, and it was about cold case Christianity. And that first one that I got, that first lesson I gave you was from YouTube, from Cold. And this guy, this is his book. He was a detective, and he was in California, and his whole family comes from a family of detectives. He was an atheist, and he basically applied his trade of detecting to witnesses, and he tried to prove that the witnesses of the Bible were false witnesses, so that way he wouldn't have any responsibility being a Christian. And when he did that, he ended up proving that the witnesses of the Bible were actually good witnesses. And if you want to go back and see that lesson's going to be on YouTube too, because Lenore City Church of Christ has a YouTube channel. And so you can go back and watch a lesson from a previous lesson, and you can share that lesson with somebody. So you can either send them this class via YouTube, or you can go to the original source. So I went and watched a video, actually 5 videos that covered the series of this book, and I got the copy of the book as well, and I created a side presentation which basically proved that the witnesses of the Bible were reliable. And because they're reliable witnesses, you can assert that their testimony is true. And if their testimony is true, then that means Christianity is true. Then the next week we talked about the global flood. And why is that an important subject? Well, the reason being is because in school today, well, actually not in school today, but back in the 60s, it was decided that we were going to take God out of schools. And when they made that decision, they thought they were trying to separate church and state. And really, there's no such thing as separation of church and state. The only separation there's supposed to be is that the state is not to create a church. Not that you can't go to church and that church can't be in society. It was basically every state of the 13 states pretty much had a state religion. There were some states that were Methodist. There were some states that were Catholic. There were some states that were Presbyterian. So every state had their own state religion. So what they wanted to do when they said the separation of church and state, and that's never in the Constitution, but that's actually in other papers and letters, is they did not want the federal government to create a federal religion for all the states. That's all that was. But what happened in the 60s during the civil rights movement and stuff is they decided they wanted to remove God because, remember, it was sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That's when that was all ushered in, and we became a debauched society. And in order to them not to feel that they were sinning, they didn't want to have God reminded to them at the schoolhouse. So basically, we took God out of school, prayer out of school, and so for 60 years, we've been teaching kids that God doesn't exist. So you wonder why now, if you approach somebody who's young, or from the age of 20 to 60 or so, in that age group, and you wonder why they believe in really strange things like people can change sexes, and they believe that that you're born that way. They believe all these really, and then if you don't agree with them, they don't talk to you about it. They scream at you, and they yell at you, and they want to fight you, and they want to hurt you, and they think it's justified because you're killing them as a human being. So this idea of removing God from society, it kind of stems back it goes even further back when it comes to science. And why I wanted to talk about this subject today was because back when Darwin in the 1800s, he took his nice ship, and I forgot what it was called, the Beagle maybe. He traveled the world, and he went to the Galapagos Islands, and he decided that there was an origin of species. He wrote a book, and he decided that everything that we have today is because nature selected it. And so we evolved basically from a one-celled organism that was created in a soup, and that one-celled organism over time became us. And so it was a very fanciful idea, but what it did do is it gave scientists and people a way out to say, hey, God didn't create us. Let's say that Father Time created us. And because of that, scientists do not agree with the idea of a young earth and creationism. And what we're going to find out about these authors, we're going to look at here in a moment, it's still prevalent today. Creation.com, again, is where I got most of the site for these guys. And also, I subscribe to their Creation magazine, which I would think would be excellent for you or your children or even your grandkids to get a subscription to this. Once you've read it, leave it in a doctor's office, leave it in some lobby, leave it somewhere where somebody can pick up and read. But it has excellent articles in there, and it comes out quarterly. So once every 4 months. Or 3 months. A quarter is 3 months, yeah. 3 times 4 is 12. Okay, public math, I'm great at it. And this is the guy who is the doctor. He's a geneticist. He's got a PhD. He's a speaker and a writer. And at CMI-US is the Creation Ministries International, the US branch. So this is the doctor whose video I watched while he was being interviewed. And again, this guy, I won't go into his resume. The other video that I watched was from these folks. It was a forum of Christian leaders, and that guy's name is John Stanford. And what I found out is, and this is all by accident, by the way, is this guy wrote about the same subject I wanted to talk about, and I ended up finding out later that these guys actually worked together in doing a study. And this all can be found on foclonline.org, all this information that I've gathered up today. Also on the YouTube channel for these folks, FOCOL Online. And it has a disclaimer here. I'm not using this for commercial purposes because I'm not getting paid to do this evening. So I'm using this, so all I'm telling you is that all this information that I've gathered up and collected for you is something that you simply can share with yourself or with somebody else that you love that might be interested in this. And so if you find one of these topics that's interesting, just share the YouTube channel and share that specific video, and it may give you some insight. Now, the other doctor here that was mentioned is, look at this guy's resume. I got this off of Wikipedia, and it was pretty accurate up until a point. It says John Stanford is an American geneticist and an inventor. And for 20 years, between 80 and 98, he was a professor at Cornell. After he retired at Cornell, he continued as a courtesy professor, and he is known for his advocacy of the pseudoscience of intelligent design. I don't think he believes it's a pseudoscience. They snuck that word in there. You know why they snuck the word pseudoscience? Because pseudo means sort of, maybe science, false science, questionable science. So why does Wikipedia throw that in there? Because they like to rewrite history. But this guy was at Stanford, he was at Cornell as a professor. He actually did plant biology, and he actually created a machine that could put genes into a plant. And so some of you might be familiar with the term CRISPR, and we'll be talking about that a little bit later, and gene splicing and different things. But this guy is a university professor, a geneticist, and an inventor. And he, because of his invention, it ended up leading to the CRISPR, which is where we can do gene modification. But I just thought it was interesting that they throw that word pseudoscience in there when I was looking him up. The other doctor, by the way, I couldn't even find him on Wikipedia. When he's published over 100 articles. So this is the video that I used for Dr. Sanford. It was called Good Science Affirms Scripture, Restoring Adam and Eve. And he's the president of the Logos Research Association. These are 3 of the books. I've ordered 2 of these books. I'm going to be talking a little bit about genetic entropy in today's talk. And then the condensed bones, we may have just one lesson specifically on this book alone, because we were taught that we developed from apes. And there was the famous monkey trial that we had just near here. I don't remember if it was the turn of the century when it happened, but Sandy and I went through that town, and we said we ought to go back and visit that museum at some time. But I think there's an anniversary of that just happened. But anyway, that trial decided that creationism was wrong, and this atheist wanted to teach atheism in school. And this contested bones is about all those those people we said they were between ape and man, those missing links, like the Neanderthals and all these, pseudo-man, caveman, all those people. And so what these doctors did is they went back and looked at all those bones using genetic DNA testing to find out whether they were actually in-betweens. And it's very interesting because they actually were not in-betweens. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. DNA, what is it? All right, according to these 2 doctors, these geneticists, they said that DNA can't be more than 4,500 years old. And what happened 4,500 years ago? We talked about it last week. It was the flood, a catastrophic event that wiped out all animal life on the planet. And the 4 topics that we're going to talk about today are genetic entropy and what that means, ancient DNA, mitochondrial Eve, and Y chromosome Adam. So what is DNA? DNA is the molecule that holds your genetic code. It is the hereditary material in humans and almost all other organisms, and when organisms means a living thing. And we've seen that double helix, that ladder, it looks like it's twisting. But what you don't realize about this molecule, it has 3 billion base pairs. 3 billion. This is microscopic. It has 20,000 genes on it and 23 pairs of chromosomes. Now, the genetic instructions for the development, functioning, growth, and reproduction of all known living organisms is in every cell of your body. So this DNA code that makes you and all your functions in every cell of your body, excluding platelets and red blood cells because they don't have a nucleus, this code is in there. This thing has got 3 billion base pairs, 20,000 genes on it, and 23 pairs of chromosomes. It's basically been described as a recipe book or an instruction manual that's encoded in a specific sequence of 4 chemicals. So your DNA code is basically just 4 chemicals in a sequence. And that sequence determines how you turn out and how you're differentiated from every other living organism. So what the doctor's on the left and the interviewer's on the right, and he says basically the sheer presence of DNA that's claimed to be hundreds to thousands, if not millions of years old, argues against itself. And the reason for that, it can't be hundreds and thousands of millions of years old because DNA breaks down quickly. It's attacked by oxygen. It's attacked by water. It can form knots and then snap. So what we're going to look at is the first topic is genetic entropy. Entropy basically is the idea that things go from orderly to disorderly, and anybody who has kids understand that concept. all right? You know everything breaks down. Your car breaks down. Everything wears out. Everything gets worse. If you don't paint your house for 10 years, guess what? Your house needs paint. The paint wears off. Your roof gets the water and the rain and the hail. The roof, the rocks on those shingles wear off. Everything wears out. Everything wears down. Everything goes from something complex to something simple. That's called entropy, when things go from order to disorder. And that's in everything. It's actually called the law of entropy. Well, it happens in genetics too, and it happens with DNA as well. So nothing lasts, order becomes disorder. Mutations accumulate up until the point of an extinction point. But what's interesting about genetics and about DNA is you can actually measure that decay. It can be measured. It's empirical, which means you can observe it. It can be repeated by somebody else. And what's interesting about this topic and why I liked it so much is because, remember, these scientists have been told that God doesn't exist, so anything that implies a young earth implies God. So they go into school thinking, oh, I can't believe in God and I can't believe in a young earth, because if I do, then my professor's going to mock me, my classmates are going to ridicule me, and I'll be thought to be an ignorant, Bible thumper. But in actuality, in genetics, you can actually measure the mutation rate, and that's pretty amazing. Natural selection, which means the survival of the fittest, is really not the survival of the fittest. It's the survival of whatever reproduces the most. So natural selection is not about who's the strongest, the fastest. It's about who can procreate the best. So think about that. So it's not necessarily, the biggest, strongest person or animal. It's basically which one can have multiples of itself. So when a population stops having children, it dies out if you don't replace yourself. And so the survival of the fittest is going to be the populations that say, like maybe the Catholics or the Islamists, who say, let's have 20 kids, let's have 10 kids. Guess who the populations are going to be here in 50 years? It's not going to be the Christians who are having 1.2 babies. Sandy and I didn't have a 1.2. We had a 0. So, so what happens is population, the same thing that happens to population and genetics, things, if you don't reproduce, then it stops and it dies out. And the other thing is that natural selection is also blind to genetic mutations. Natural selection doesn't fix them. It just lets them continue. And eventually what happens if they build up, and the reason why the mutation rates, when they're measurable, which we'll find out in a minute, is after millions and billions of years, mutations would have made all of us extinct already. So in fact, it would happen in less than 100,000 years and probably less than 10,000 years. But I get ahead of myself. So genetic entropy basically is the breaking down of the genetic code. Remember, this DNA code that we have is very fragile. It's small. It's basically 4 chemicals that are bound together in this helix, which has got billions of pieces, and it breaks down. Natural selection is blind to most mutations, so they tend to build up over time, and then what happens is the species cannot be billions of years old alone or millions of years old because the mutations would have built up and basically killed them off. So this is what we looked at last week. Now we talked about, I showed you that through lineages and stuff about the flood and about these examples, but right here what you can see, you probably can't read all the names, but at the beginning of time where Noah was, Noah and the folks around him lived 900 years. And then Shem, his son, lived 600 years. And then by the time Abraham, which is in his lineage, was 175 years. And then Moses was 120 years. And then when they got around to King David, it was 70 years was the average lifespan. And then when you got to the Roman times, it was 45 years. And we've improved a little bit on that based off of less war and a little bit cleaner hygiene, I should say. So you can see what happens is this decline is exponential and it rounds out and it ends up going to a 0 number out here eventually. And so this declining lifespans of Noah is a representation of what happens to the genetics. So there's 3 guys that this guy, when he was doing his research for the paper that he wrote to prove this from a measurable standpoint, from an empirical standpoint, he asked his cohorts because he wrote this paper, and then he asked his cohorts, hey, what do you think about this? And his cohort said, no human geneticist doubts man is degenerating or becoming worse. And another guy said, we're inferior to cavemen. Our fitness is declining 1% to 3% per generation, according to the Dr. Crow. And Dr. Lynch said, we're degenerating at 1% to 5% per generation. So the geneticists actually kind of agree that this is happening, but they won't talk about why and what's happening, what's the mechanism of this. This geneticist decided to test this, and he wrote this paper. And if you notice here, it says Robert W. Carter, which is the guy who has, and then the other guy is John Sanford, and those happen to be the two guys in the video. So it was funny, I didn't know these guys were even related. I just happened to, I guess Google probably knew, or YouTube knew, because you know how they feed you whatever you want. The algorithm tells them what to give you. So they gave me, I was looking at one thing, and then I looked at something else, and then when I looked at the two things, I said, I'll combine those two things to make this presentation. And then I come to find out that the article that was written, that was, not the article, actually, the study that was done to model this decline was actually done by both those people, and they worked together. But when it was published, which I think I'll show you later, I'll point something out to you. So there's the study that they did, and this was in, I think, 2012 was when this article was written. I think the study was done in 2007. But what it basically showed, you can't see this, and it's not a very good graph, but it's showing that things change in a linear fashion over time. The mutations change in a straight line. But what happens is, as the selection goes down, is this curve, when those changes affect, they end up exponentially going down and having this curve. And that curve, what they showed in their study, was it matches, they studied a H1N1, which is a virus that caused the Spanish epidemic, Spanish flu, back in the early 1900s, around 1918 or so, and killed lots of people worldwide. And then after a few years, it became extinct. And so it's showing, and they actually, because they have data, they've got data points all the way from 1918 until this study was done from that influenza, because you know the CDC and all of them, they keep all that information. And so all the lab results and all the data points that he got was from an active H1N1 database. So he traced it back, and it showed, again, that these mutations that were happening to the influenza virus from the Spanish flu was linear, just like it was said over here in his mathematical computation. And it also said that what's going to happen is it's going to cause a decline in the population that's shaped like this, where it's a large drop off and then it gradually rounds out to zero. And it showed that with the virus here, you can't see the numbers, but the virus did the exact same thing over a period of about 80 years. It went from killing lots and lots of people to killing nobody by 2000 and something. So that's what that graph shows, and that's what his study showed. And it's just, there's another picture of it, but basically you're seeing the same thing. The curve and the curve, all the curves matched in his study. So genetic entropy is actually a real thing that really happens. So, but our hope, just because we're getting genetically worse, what happens is every time a mother and father to get there and have a child, the DNA from the father matches up with the DNA of the mother, and they create a new DNA thing. And what happens when there's a change or a mutation in that parent, then that adoption could possibly happen in the child, and it'll be in the child's DNA sequence, even though the most DNA faults end up being repaired by the DNA itself and by our systems. But ultimately speaking, even though we're degenerating as a species genetically, it doesn't mean there's no hope, because we know that Jesus is coming back, and we're not quite there yet. So the second topic of this thing is called ancient DNA. And what that's going to talk about is the word ancient is not what you think. A lot of people talk about ancient means 70 million years ago, or 65 million years ago, the dinosaurs died out, and then this is 100 million years old, this is 40 million years old, this is 100,000 years old. The word ancient here refers to stuff less than 10,000 years old. And here's the reason why. Ancient only is because the secular assumption of the word aged earth, because the scientists wouldn't believe that the earth is old and that we evolved from it. They use the word ancient. But that's because they take an anti-biblical secular perspective, that God's account must not be true, so anything that says God's out of the picture must be true. But what's happened is DNA didn't exist prior to the flood, because all our DNA evidence isn't older than the flood, isn't older than 4,500 years ago. And the reason for that is because DNA is simply chemical reactions in this really small form. And it decays. If it gets exposed to oxygen, it decays. If it gets in water, it decays. So if something dies, guess where it goes? It goes in the ground, it gets exposed to oxygen, and it decays. And then also, the bacteria and the fungi eat it. They'll consume it. So guess what? When you dig up a dinosaur bone or a mammoth bone or a saber-toothed tiger's bone, and you uncover it, even if it's been in permafrost, guess what? It gets exposed to the air. So the DNA, there's very, very little DNA, but they won't get rid of the word ancient because they want you to think it's millions and millions of years old. But none of it is aged past 10,000 years, and most likely 4,500 years ago. So a million-year-old animal, and we have this picture of this Tyrannosaurus rex, which we may talk about that in another topic, but they're saying they're millions of years old. And then you've got the woolly mammoth that they found in permafrost, and they say it's 1 million years old. But with ancient DNA, the thing is, we want Jurassic Park to be real. Everybody wants that movie to be real. Wouldn't it be great to go to a park and see all these dinosaurs? And so as we're chasing after dinosaurs, remember that genome, how big did I say it was? Billions of pieces, and then, tens of thousands of genes, and then 23 chromosomes, at least for a human, pairs. Those things don't exist. We don't have DNA for a dinosaur. Now, we may have a fragment, and we'll talk about that, but eventually we will have. What's going to happen, though, is when they date that DNA, it's going to be less than 4,500 years old, based on this mutation cycle. Carbon dating, which is what they're using right now, is existing in the DNA sequence exponentially decreases. What happens is when you get back to that curve that goes up like this, the closer you get to the flood, all of a sudden, what we're going to find out is they have things like from the Egyptian tombs, they have sarcophaguses, they have the Jericho walls, they have all these ancient relics that they can measure. They know how old they are based on historical testimony, from the ancient records. So they know that when Tut was in charge, they know when this guy was in charge, they know when this was built. So they have a historical point, they can put a point on a calendar. But the carbon dating starts to diverge away from that point. And the closer you get to the flood, the further the disparity. The further the divergence. So basically, when that graph was really tall on this side and it was really small on this side, as the closer the carbon dating gets back towards the date of the flood, then it's no longer on that line, it's up here. And that's what they showed. So even if once they do get a complete dinosaur genome path, they're going to find out that the DNA itself that they have is going to be less than 5,000 years old. The other thing that they're trying to do is they're trying to tell you that they're going to clone a woolly mammoth. And they've got a group in Japan trying to do that. And what they're doing is they don't have the DNA of a mammoth because, again, it doesn't exist. It's been decayed, it's destroyed, it's gone. But what they do have is they have an elephant. And they do know how to affect that elephant to make it hairy. They do know how to make that elephant's tusk do this. They do know how to make that elephant's forehead bigger. So they're going to create a mammoth by splicing genes onto to their DNA code using that CRISPR or something else. And they're going to introduce that into the egg of a real elephant and then have that elephant have a baby and then say it's a woolly mammoth. It's really not a woolly mammoth. It's just an elephant that's been spliced. So don't let these scientists trick you. So DNA barcoding, and this is the other thing which I think is interesting. We don't have a barcode, but basically what happens is, in order to simplify things, is that in all animals, there's a gene on the mitochondria. Most of our DNA code is in our nucleus of our cell. Every cell has a nucleus except for a couple of them like platelets and things like that. But most of them, all of your DNA is in that nucleus of each and every cell of your body. But there's also the engine of your cells called the mitochondria, and it has DNA. And on that, there's some markers, which they're calling this barcode, which doesn't change very much. And if it changes too much, it ends up killing the organism. So there's not going to be a whole bunch of mutations that built up. And so what they've done is they've been able to identify, say, for example, what they found is in canines, where you got wolves, coyotes, domesticated dogs, shepherd dogs. You've got all these forms of canine. Well, according to our evolutionary chain that we learned in school, is that they said the wolf came first, and then they branched off and made these different types. And you've seen them all with horses, all different, they trace them all back. But what happens when you look at these DNA barcodes and you look at these different animals, every single one of them has the same date associated with it. They all started at the same time. So all the genetic code goes back 4,500 years, back to this time. So even though they have identified these barcodes, and the other interesting thing too about this DNA barcode thing is that humans are so much alike that we cannot even identify between races using this barcode. So there's really no such thing as race. That's something we created for ourselves so that way we can discriminate against each other. So this whole idea of race, when you look at it from a genetic standpoint, there's no such thing. So that's just simply, everybody's got all these variations in their DNA code. It's in all of you. So that's a very interesting thing, and maybe that'll be a time for another topic sometime. But the human species cannot use this DNA barcode because we're too much alike. So there's 5 genetic evidences. We're going to talk about the first 2 there, mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam. Now these are scientific terms. Why do you think they called them that? Because Eve says there's just one lady that started the whole thing, and Y chromosome Adam is implying that one man. So in genetic world, even the geneticists say there's an original man. And they also say there's an original woman. But they also say it's not Adam and Eve. But why did they call them that? That's how stupid. No, I think it's hubris. That's really what I think it is. They are so arrogant that they'll even call it Adam and Eve, but then they'll deny that it has anything to do with the concept that we find in the Bible. But we'll find out from what we're looking at here in a second. Mitochondrial Eve is so named, but not to be biblical. But it points back genetically to a single mother. So every person who's female can be traced back to this, well, all of us can be traced back to the one single woman genetically. Isn't that ironic? And this other thing that's interesting about this DNA, it only comes from the moms. So if you don't have any girls, it stops with you and your family. So think about, so you have a lot of dead ends. Like in Sandy and I, our case, mine's dead-ended. Hers is dead-ended. So, but we can trace all of us back to one woman, every single one of us in this room. And that proves, again, because by tracing that back, and the DNA can be traced back to one person, the starting point, guess what that starting point is? I'll show you how these guys did it in a study. The mutation rates point to only a few thousand years of genetic divergence, which aligns with the biblical record. So you can actually Google this, mitochondrial Eve, the mother of us all, and all our mitochromosomes come from one woman. This is that study this is the same study that I showed you earlier that had both the authors' names on it, that article that was written. But in this study here that was actually published in Nucleic Acids Research 2007, Volume 3, 35, number 9. Scientific study, only Robert Carter's name's listed. And the reason they did that is because these journals will discriminate against you if you have a creationist as part of your science pool. So they decided not to put Sanford's name on this. Not because he didn't contribute or didn't do the work, it's simply so that way the journal would publish it. So here's what's interesting. This is a divergence target. Basically, the center point, the red point in the center is Eve, this mitochondrial Eve, and the rings are 50 years. So most of the divergence, these are all the mutations that have happened. These are all living people today. This is how far they diverge from Eve. They've got basically, the average is 21 mutations in their mitochondria. And of that mutation rate, they've determined that that 0.1 change happens per generation. And so what you can do is, and it takes, how many generations does it take to get to 21 mutations? And they found out that's 210 generations by taking that math that they can measure. And so basically, if you multiply a generation, which in this case they used 25 years, it puts mitochondrial Eve at 5,250 years ago. So even and this was all scientifically done by measurable stuff. Same thing with Y chromosome Adam. He's so named but not meant to be biblical. It points back genetically to a single father. All men came from men. That Y chromosome can only go through the male. Evidence suggests, again, young earth because of mutation rates, and it also aligns with the biblical record. So you can Google Y chromosome Adam. It's there. All Y chromosomes come from one man. We now have an approximation of his chromosome Y, and there's been very little variation because Adam was recent. Now this is the divergence of that group of the men. Well, if you notice, Adam's in the center, and these rings represent 200 mutations. So the average for the mutations for this Y chromosome Adam is, now the geneticists claim it's 57,000 years ago to 340,000 years ago when this happened. But according to this study, in the rate of the change, there's about 300 mutations. And of those 300 mutations, it takes about one per generation. So you take one per generation times the 300 gives you 300 generations, which again, 300 generations is 7,500 years, again, which is in the biblical ballpark. So what's at stake? If there's no Adam and Eve, then God's character is being impugned. Our trust in Scripture is impugned. Our place as image bearers is impugned. The meaning of the cross is impugned, and the nature of heaven is impugned. The scriptural evidence, which is interesting, is the first 3 chapters of Genesis are foundational to the Bible. The New Testament authors quote Genesis as history, especially Genesis 1 through 11. The New Testament also authors refer to the fall, the serpent, Cain, Abel, Seth, and Enoch. Jesus refers to Adam, Eve, Noah, the flood, and the ark. There are twice as many references to Adam and Eve in the New Testament than the Old Testament. And what's interesting here is I've got every single one of these references. I'm not going to go through any of them, but I just want to let you know they're all there. There are 60 references in the New Testament directly to the first 10 chapters of Genesis. And if you say that they're not true and are not a historical record, then what you're doing is you're saying that all those writers of the New Testament are lying. And you're implying that Christ is a liar. So that's what's interesting about this, and that's why the evolutionists, but this is the point. I would believe in God more than I would believe in man. So that's basically the point of these lessons, are to show you that despite DNA being such an amazing thing, which I have a little bit of a think here. Advances in molecular biology have enabled scientists to edit DNA using technologies like CRISPR. And this is what CRISPR stands for: clustered, regularly interspaced, short palindromic repeats. And it's a technique that's been adapted from bacterial immune systems that allows precise modification of genetic sequences. This has opened the new possibilities in medicine, agriculture, biotechnology, including the development of GMOs and potential gene therapies. So what my point is with all this divergence that we've had, and it all points, they realize DNA is real. They know DNA is fragile. They know they don't have any for anything that's prior to the flood ending back 4,000 or 5,000 years. They know that this mutation rate can be measured, and they still want to say that God doesn't exist. So what I want you to do is realize that there's evidence out there that shows that God does exist from a DNA standpoint. And all the DNA is basically a code that allows us to recreate ourselves. And every time we do, minute changes happen, and over time, those minute changes will end up destroying the mechanism itself because of the law of entropy. So that's basically the lesson. I think I'm a minute or so short, but we'll get back with you for the devotional. Thank you.